90 missiles in a single night, not from a superpower and not from a country with aircraft carriers or stealth bombers, but from a nation the world was told had been crippled, outgunned, and cornered. While those missiles lit up the skies over Tel Aviv, something happened that military strategists in Washington, Jerusalem, and every Gulf capital had quietly feared for years. Israel's air defense systems, the most sophisticated layered shield ever built, began running out of interceptors. The Arrow missiles were gone. The question hanging over the world right now is not whether Israel can survive the next wave, but whether the global economy can survive what Iran has already done to the Strait of Hormuz. We are going to walk through this entire situation step by step, because what is unfolding right now in the Middle East is not just a regional conflict. It is the most consequential geopolitical and economic event of the 21st century. By the time you finish this, you will understand exactly why the price of everything you buy is about to change, why the global energy market is teetering on the edge of collapse, and why a 33-mile waterway is now the most dangerous strip of water on Earth. To understand what happened in Tel Aviv, you need to understand how we got here, because this war did not start with missiles. It started with a phone call, a miscalculation, and a moment that changed everything. In the first weeks of 2026, Iran and the United States were actually talking. There were indirect nuclear negotiations in Oman, and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi described a historic agreement as being within reach. There was cautious optimism from diplomats on both sides. The world believed briefly that the long standoff between Washington and Tehran was finally moving towards some form of resolution. Then everything fell apart. On February 24th, during the State of the Union address, Donald Trump stood before Congress and accused Iran of reviving its efforts to build nuclear weapons and advanced ballistic missiles capable of striking Europe and American bases overseas. He issued a direct warning, and then 4 days later, on the 28th of February 2026, the United States and Israel launched simultaneous surprise airstrikes across Iran. The strikes killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and dozens of Iran's most senior military commanders in a single coordinated operation. The Islamic Republic, which had ruled Iran for over 40 years, lost its top leadership in a matter of hours. The world had expected Iran to respond, but what no one fully anticipated was the scale, precision, and sheer relentlessness of what came next. Within hours of the American and Israeli strikes, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps activated what it called Operation True Promise 4. Unlike previous Iranian missile salvos, which had been symbolic, high-profile, and largely intercepted, this one was designed with a completely different purpose. On the very first day, Iran fired 90 ballistic missiles at Israel alone. These were not spread out over a week or launched in small probing barrages. They were fired in a single coordinated assault, targeting the most densely populated corridor in Israel, stretching from Tel Aviv through central Israel down toward Jerusalem. Iron Dome, David's Sling, and the Arrow system, Israel's three-layered missile defense architecture, were pushed to their absolute operational limits on day one. The interception rate was high, but Iran had done the math, and they knew something that would only become clear to the public weeks later. Every interceptor Israel fires costs a lot of money. The Arrow 3 interceptor, which Israel uses against long-range Iranian ballistic missiles, costs approximately $2 to $3 million per round. David's Sling interceptors cost roughly $1 million each, while Iron Dome missiles run about $50,000 apiece. Iran's Shahed drones cost somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 to manufacture. The economic equation is brutal. Iran can flood the sky with low-cost weapons, and Israel has to respond with interceptors that cost 10, 20, or 50 times as much. On a long enough timeline, that math leads to one inevitable conclusion. The interceptors run out before the missiles do. By the 16th day of the war, that feared scenario was no longer theoretical. It was becoming real. Israel informed the United States this week that it was running critically low on ballistic missile interceptors. The Israeli military publicly denied the report, insisting it was prepared and ready to handle any scenario. But the denial itself told a story. When a military is genuinely comfortable with its stockpile, it does not need to say anything at all. When it feels the need to publicly push back against a report about interceptor shortages, that is the moment to pay attention. While that internal crisis was developing, Iran had already added a second layer of complexity that was making the intercept problem dramatically worse. Imagine you are an air defense operator watching a missile inbound on your radar. You have seconds to make a decision. You fire an interceptor, the missile is hit, and then the warhead opens. Not explodes, but opens. From that single missile, between 20 and 24 individual bomblets are released, each the size of a small grenade, scattering across a radius of 10 kilometers. Your interceptor may have destroyed the delivery vehicle, but the payload is already in the air, falling, spreading, and completely beyond the reach of any existing missile defense system. This is the cluster munition problem that has been haunting Israel since the opening days of the conflict. Israeli military officials confirmed that approximately half of the roughly 300 ballistic missiles Iran fired at Israel in the first 10 days of the war were equipped with cluster munition warheads. Half. That means out of every 2 missiles Iran launched, one was specifically designed to defeat Israel's air defenses, not by overpowering them, but by making interception functionally irrelevant. Even a successful intercept could not stop the bomblets once released. Missile defense experts described this as a mechanism designed to bypass active defense entirely. Iran had engineered a way to turn its own missile losses into battlefield victories. If the interceptor missed, the full warhead hit. If the interceptor connected, the bomblets still scattered. Either way, Iran's objective was achieved, forcing millions of Israelis into bomb shelters, draining Israel's interceptor stockpile, and applying enormous psychological and economic pressure on Israeli society. The strategy was slow, methodical, and absolutely deliberate. However, the conventional news coverage was missing the real center of gravity in this conflict, which was not Tel Aviv or even Iran. It was a narrow body of water, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, located at the southeastern corner of the Arabian Peninsula and bordered by the Iranian coastline on 3 sides, the Strait of Hormuz. What Iran did there on the second day of the war will ultimately define this conflict's place in history. On the 2nd of March, 2 days after the American and Israeli strikes began, a senior commander in Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that the Strait of Hormuz was closed. Not threatened or monitored, but closed. Any vessel linked to the United States, Israel, or their allies attempting to transit the waterway would be considered a legitimate target and would be set ablaze. Within 24 hours, tanker traffic through the strait dropped by approximately 70%. Within days, it was approaching zero. More than 150 ships dropped anchor on both sides of the waterway. None of them knew how long they would wait, and some are still waiting now. The consequences of that decision rippled across the global economy with a speed and severity that most analysts had not predicted, even in their worst-case models. Consider what actually moves through the Strait of Hormuz on a typical day. Approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil, representing roughly 1/5 of the entire global oil supply. Additionally, approximately 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas passes through the same corridor. 30% of Europe's jet fuel originates from or passes through the strait. Beyond energy, the corridor carries massive volumes of petrochemicals, fertilizers, aluminum feedstocks, steel inputs, and consumer goods. Every single one of those supply chains stopped on the 2nd of March, and the cascading effects began almost immediately. Within days of the closure, Brent crude oil surged from roughly $65 per barrel to nearly $120. It partially stabilized around $103 after the International Energy Agency took the unprecedented step of authorizing the release of 400 million barrels from global emergency reserves. However, analysts were quick to point out a mathematical reality that made those reserve releases look more like a public relations gesture than an actual solution. The IEA's 400 million barrels represents approximately 20 days of normal Hormuz traffic. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve held around 415 million barrels total. Combined, those emergency stockpiles could cover roughly a month of global demand. After that, the world would be on its own. Then the damage began moving downstream into every sector of the global economy with a kind of quiet devastation that does not generate dramatic news footage, but transforms the economic lives of hundreds of millions of people. Fertilizer prices surged. Urea, a critical agricultural input, jumped from $475 per metric ton to $680 almost overnight. 1/3 of all global fertilizer trade moves through the Strait of Hormuz. With planting season for corn and soybeans approaching in the American Midwest, analysts warned that the blockade could translate directly into food inflation that would hit grocery stores by autumn. Supply chain executives began warning that for commodities transiting the strait to Asian and European markets, existing inventories typically cover only a few weeks. After that, shortages would begin appearing across multiple sectors simultaneously. About 85% of polyethylene exports from the Middle East move through the strait. A sustained blockade would raise the price of packaging, automotive components, and consumer goods across every importing economy. Goldman Sachs economists modeled multiple scenarios and raised their odds of a U.S. recession by 5 percentage points to 25%, even in a moderate oil disruption scenario. Oxford Economics went further, modeling a situation where global oil prices averaged $140 per barrel for 2 months. Their conclusion was stark. That level of energy disruption would be enough to push the Eurozone, the United Kingdom, and Japan into economic contraction. It would create what they described as an economic standstill in the United States. The IRGC's own spokesman warned very simply that oil would reach $200 per barrel in the coming days, a level the world had never seen in history. The shipping industry responded with complete withdrawal. Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd two of the world's largest maritime carriers, suspended all Middle East routes. War risk insurance for vessels attempting to transit the strait was removed from coverage entirely on the 5th of March, making the economic risk mathematically impossible for most ship owners to absorb. At the same time, Iran executed a third strategic dimension by systematically targeting every American military base and every Gulf Arab country that had, in Iran's assessment, facilitated the U.S.-Israeli campaign against it. The breadth of these attacks was staggering. Bahrain's capital, Manama, was struck multiple times, including the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in the Jaffa area. Kuwait International Airport was hit by drones, while in the United Arab Emirates, the IRGC fired missiles and drones at the American Air Base at Al Dhafra. A drone even struck a building inside the Dubai International Financial Center. Black smoke rose over the port of Fujairah, and in Saudi Arabia, 6 ballistic missiles aimed at the Al-Kharj governorate were intercepted, along with multiple drone attacks approaching Riyadh. Qatar intercepted 4 ballistic missiles, and Iraq remained a major secondary theater with explosions near Kirkuk Airport and sustained drone attacks on Erbil. More than 50 Iranian drones entered Saudi airspace overnight on March 13th alone. Iran's strikes even reached into Turkish airspace, with ballistic missiles being intercepted by NATO forces on 3 separate occasions, creating alliance anxiety that NATO had not experienced in decades. The strategic logic behind these Gulf strikes was layered. On the surface, they were retaliation, but at a deeper level, Iran was sending a specific message to every Gulf state. Your neutrality is not neutrality. If you have allowed American aircraft to take off from your soil or permitted American warships to use your ports, you are a participant in this conflict. The Reuters analysis was direct. By sending missiles at Gulf states, Iran caused those governments to realize that it posed an existential threat to their security independent of Washington. Saudi Arabia saw its eastern province oil infrastructure targeted, while the UAE watched smoke rise from its financial district. Qatar, which hosts the massive Al Udeid air base, found itself intercepting missiles aimed at the same infrastructure it relied on for stability. None of these countries were prepared for the reality that neutrality would not be accepted. However, the most consequential moment occurred at Karg Island. Karg Island is the terminal through which approximately 90% of Iran's crude oil exports pass. When U.S. forces struck the island on the 14th of March, they sent a direct message. American aircraft hit military targets on the island, and while Donald Trump stated that oil infrastructure had been spared for reasons of decency, he warned that it could be targeted if Iran continued to interfere with shipping. The United States had just demonstrated that the economic engine of the Iranian state was one decision away from being permanently disabled. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, responded by vowing to continue the Hormuz blockade and pledging that attacks on Gulf neighbors would continue. His precise status became a major intelligence question, with U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth suggesting he was wounded and Trump questioning if he was even alive. Despite a decapitated command structure and degraded stockpiles, the Iranian government continued to project power. While missile launch rates declined, dropping by more than 90% from their peak by day 10, the core strategic objectives had been accomplished. The Strait of Hormuz was closed, the Gulf states were shaken, and Israel's interceptor stockpile was under severe strain. Trump told NBC News that Iran wanted a deal, but Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi flatly contradicted this, stating Iran had never asked for a ceasefire and was ready to defend itself indefinitely. As Trump tried to assemble a multinational naval coalition to reopen the strait, appealing to Japan, South Korea, China, France, and the UK, the response was silence. China had economic reasons to want the strait open, but political reasons not to align with a U.S. military operation. Europe faced a major energy crisis, but governments were calculating whether military participation would serve their interests. Legally, the Strait of Hormuz is not fully international waters, and acting without the consent of Iran and Oman carried diplomatic risks that few were eager to absorb. We are now on day 16 of a war that has escalated into the largest disruption to global energy supply since the 1970s. Israel is managing an interceptor shortage while absorbing nightly cluster munition attacks. The Gulf states are intercepting missiles over their capitals while calculating their long-term security alignment. Iran is operating under an uncertain leader with degraded capacity, yet it still holds the global economy hostage with 350 oil tankers sitting idle outside the strait. Semiconductor factories in Taiwan face power rationing, and recession probabilities are climbing. Military analysts note that as Iran's conventional capacity degrades, the strategic logic of other options, like proxy networks in Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen, becomes more attractive. Every day the strait remains shut, economic pressure intensifies, and the probability of miscalculation increases. Geography remains Iran's ultimate expression of advantage. While the U.S. can destroy launchers, it cannot move the Iranian coastline. There is no easy solution to the geography of the Strait of Hormuz. and alternative routes cannot absorb the volume. The only real solution is to reopen the strait, either through military force or a diplomatic agreement, neither of which is simple or quick. What makes this moment dangerous is the convergence of multiple pressure systems. The UNCTAD assessment warned that the shock arrived as many developing economies face high debt and limited fiscal space, meaning rising costs could trigger genuine social instability. The Hormuz crisis is not just a problem for wealthy nations, it could destabilize Asia, Africa, and Latin America. When fertilizer is too expensive, farmers plant less, crop yields drop, and food prices rise, a cascade that reaches social cohesion globally. Yet, the situation contains the seeds of its own resolution, as the conflict is extraordinarily costly for everyone involved, including Iran, which relies on oil revenue. China and Saudi Aramco are already recalculating security assumptions in real time. The world that exists when this conflict ends will not be the same as the one that existed on February 27th. Supply chains are now understood to be fragile, and military force is back at the center of international politics. The lesson Iran delivered is about asymmetric conflict. How a country that cannot match conventional military power can nonetheless extract an enormous price by targeting global economic systems. That lesson will reverberate for years to come, and the next chapter of this story has not yet been written. Stay with us, because when it is, you will want to understand everything that came before.